Let's begin with something most people underestimate: the power of absence. We live in a world that constantly screams at us to assert ourselves, to always be present, to keep showing up, to push until we're noticed. But there's another form of strength, one that often speaks louder than presence itself, and that's the deliberate decision to step back, to withdraw, to let silence do the talking. Absence has weight. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? That by not being there, you can make a greater impact than if you were. And yet, that's how human psychology works. We often only recognize the true value of something when it's missing. Think about it. People take sunlight for granted until winter arrives and the days grow short. They take health for granted until illness strikes. They take water for granted until they feel the pangs of thirst. The mind seems wired to overlook the things that are consistent, reliable, and ever-present. So when you are always available, always there to absorb the chaos, to offer reassurance, or to bend to someone else's demands, your value becomes invisible. You become the air, essential, but unnoticed. But when you pull back, when you create that absence, it's like oxygen being removed from a room. Suddenly, every breath becomes noticed. Suddenly, you matter in a way that was ignored when you were present. Now, disappearing like a king isn't about playing childish games. It's not about punishing or manipulating. It's about demonstrating self-respect. When you choose absence over constant availability, you're teaching others that your presence is not a cheap commodity. It is not something to be squandered or dismissed. It carries a cost. It has weight. And by leaving, by stepping back into your own sovereignty, you create the conditions for recognition that cannot occur while you are still endlessly present. There's a psychological truth here that's worth exploring. The brain craves contrast. We notice hot after we've been cold. We appreciate silence after noise. We value peace after chaos. And we feel the sting of regret when something we thought would always be there suddenly is not. In relationships, especially, this principle plays out with brutal clarity. When a man refuses to disappear, when he clings, begs, or hovers, he robs the other person of the opportunity to feel his absence. And without absence, there can be no recognition, no true appreciation, and therefore no regret. But when a man steps away like a king, calmly, without rage, without bitterness, he allows the other person to confront the reality of what they've lost. That confrontation is often unbearable because it reveals something that presence never could. It reveals value in retrospect. It transforms memories from ordinary into extraordinary. Every small act of kindness, every moment of patience, every demonstration of strength suddenly shines with a light that was hidden when it was taken for granted. The absence resurrects meaning. This is why absence has a gravitational pull. It doesn't just create space, it bends the perception of time itself. When you're gone, the mind replays your presence, often in sharper detail than when you were there. The smallest gestures, overlooked before, now loom large. She remembers the stability you carried, the calm in your voice, the way you stood tall in chaos. And each recollection, each fragment of memory, grows heavier under the shadow of your absence. That weight is what breeds regret. But notice something crucial. The effectiveness of absence depends on the way it's carried out. A king doesn't disappear in desperation. He doesn't slam doors, burn bridges, or scream for attention. He simply withdraws. Quietly. Decisively. And because he does so with dignity, the absence doesn't look like avoidance. It looks like authority. It sends a message. I don't need to be here to prove my worth. I don't need to argue to demonstrate my value. My very withdrawal speaks for me. Now, there's something deeply emotional about this dynamic, something that cuts to the core of what it means to be human. We long for what we cannot have. We regret most deeply when something is lost, not when it is present. And the tragedy and the beauty is that absence sharpens love, sharpens memory, sharpens respect. It forces the heart to face the void left behind. So when I say, disappear like a king, and she regrets everything, I don't mean it as some shallow tactic to get revenge or to manipulate someone into missing you. I mean it as a profound truth about human psychology and human dignity. Your presence only has value when your absence has consequence. And if you can summon the strength to step away with authority, to let the silence speak louder than words, you create the conditions for recognition, perhaps even transformation. At the deepest level, it comes down to this: your absence teaches others what your presence truly meant. And sometimes, that is the most powerful lesson you can leave behind. So carry yourself with that awareness. Don't disappear in bitterness. Disappear with grace. Withdraw with authority. And let the silence speak on your behalf. Because in the end, a man who can step away with dignity doesn't just walk out of the room. He leaves an echo that cannot be ignored. And it is in that echo that regret is born. When we talk about disappearing, the way it's done makes all the difference. Because you can disappear like a man who's been broken, or you can disappear like a king. And the contrast between the two couldn't be greater. One radiates desperation, the other radiates authority. One leaves an impression of weakness, the other of undeniable strength. And what most men don't realize is that the manner of their withdrawal is what determines whether they're remembered with pity or with regret. Think about desperation for a moment. What does it look like? It's clinging, begging, pleading, trying to convince someone of your worth through endless explanations and arguments. It's showing up in places you're not wanted, sending messages that go unanswered, trying to keep alive what has already died. And the truth is, when you act out of desperation, you diminish yourself. You're essentially broadcasting, "I cannot stand on my own. I cannot survive without this connection. I am defined by the other's validation." That kind of behavior may stir pity, but pity is not respect. It may keep you temporarily tethered to someone, but it's a tether rooted in weakness, and weakness never commands loyalty, admiration, or love. Now compare that to disappearing with dignity. That's a very different thing. Disappearing with dignity means you recognize your value isn't up for debate. It isn't something you need to beg for or explain. It's intrinsic, woven into your very being, and if another person cannot see it, then you do not waste your breath convincing them. You withdraw, not in rage, not in bitterness, but in quiet confidence. And that confidence echoes louder than any speech you could have delivered. It communicates, "I know who I am. I know what I'm worth. I don't need you to acknowledge it for it to be real." There's something deeply powerful about restraint, about refusing to descend into chaos, even when you've been hurt or disrespected. When a man chooses dignity in his departure, he leaves an indelible mark. People remember composure. They remember strength under fire. They remember the silence that followed when they expected drama. And that memory, paradoxically, grows sharper with time. Because dignity stands in stark contrast to the volatility most people expect. Here's the psychological truth at the core of this. People judge you most not in the moments when things are easy, but in the moments when everything falls apart. That's when character is revealed. That's when your true nature comes to the surface. If you collapse into desperation, you confirm their suspicion that they were right to undervalue you. But if you rise in dignity, you force them to question themselves. You force them to revisit their judgment. And that questioning is the soil in which regret takes root. It's important to see that this isn't about revenge or some game of manipulation. It's about aligning yourself with order instead of chaos, with self-respect instead of self-destruction. When you disappear with dignity, you're making a statement that transcends the relationship itself. You're saying to yourself and to the world, "I will not sacrifice my integrity for someone who cannot see it. I will not degrade myself to hold on to what was never secure." That stance alone transforms you. And transformation is noticed. The irony is that the more dignity you show, the more likely the other person is to feel regret. Because regret doesn't come from seeing you collapse. Regret comes from seeing you stand tall without them, from realizing that your value never diminished, even when they failed to honor it. And that realization is painful because it forces them to confront the fact that they miscalculated, that they threw away something rare for something trivial. But notice again, the dignity must be real. It can't be an act. You can't pretend to walk away like a king while secretly obsessing, checking, begging in silence. That kind of falseness reveals itself. True dignity emerges from genuine self-respect, from a deep conviction that you are not defined by another's recognition. And cultivating that conviction is the real work. It's hard. It requires confronting your own fears of abandonment, your own insecurities, your own desire for external validation. But when you overcome those, you carry yourself differently. Your silence becomes heavier. Your absence becomes meaningful. And your departure becomes unforgettable. So the challenge I would put before you is this. When life gives you the choice between disappearing in desperation and disappearing in dignity, choose the latter every time. Choose to embody the strength of restraint, the calm of self-respect, the quiet power of a king who does not need to shout. Because in the end, it is not the man who pleads who is remembered with respect. It is the man who could have begged but didn't. It is the man who could have collapsed, but chose instead to stand tall in silence. Disappearing with dignity means your last impression is not of weakness, but of strength. And strength is the one thing that lingers in the mind long after you've gone. So don't vanish like a broken man. Vanish like a king. Because desperation fades quickly from memory, but dignity leaves a shadow that cannot be erased. Regret is one of the most powerful emotional forces a human being can experience, and it is almost always underestimated until it arrives. We tend to think of regret as something passive, something soft, like a shadow of sadness. But in truth, regret is brutal. It's sharp, it cuts deeply, and it does so because it is rooted in self-recognition. It doesn't merely whisper that something valuable was lost. It shouts that you were the one who failed to recognize it when you had the chance. And that realization is crushing. When a woman regrets losing a man, it's never just about him. It's not just that he's gone, or that she misses the warmth of his presence. It's deeper than that. It's that his absence exposes her blindness. It forces her to see that she miscalculated, that she dismissed something real, something solid, something rare, in exchange for something shallow, fragile, or temporary. Regret turns the mirror around and forces her to stare directly into her own error. That's why regret is not simply about longing, it's about shame. And here's the interesting thing. That mirror is only presented when the man disappears with strength, not weakness. If you collapse into bitterness, if you storm out in rage or hang around in desperation, there's no mirror. She doesn't see herself in that. She sees only your collapse, and that collapse confirms her decision. But when you withdraw with dignity, when you vanish like a king, you hand her a mirror she cannot put down. Every memory of you, every moment where she dismissed your worth, is reframed under the weight of your absence. And that reframing generates regret, not because you've demanded it, but because her own conscience demands it. Now, regret is interesting from a psychological perspective because it reshapes memory. Memory is not static, it is a living process. The past is constantly being reconstructed in the mind, and regret is one of the forces that colors that reconstruction. Something ordinary at the time can become extraordinary in retrospect when regret reframes it. The little acts of patience, the quiet support, the strength you embodied day after day, they might have seemed small or unremarkable when taken for granted. But under the lens of regret, they grow enormous. They acquire a kind of sacred glow because they can no longer be accessed. And that transformation is often unbearable because it means that what was dismissed lightly has now become untouchable, irretrievable. This is why absence matters so much. Without absence, there can be no regret because the brain does not have the space to reconstruct memory and recognize its value. A constant presence dulls the recognition of worth. Absence sharpens it. When you step away with dignity, you essentially gift her with the possibility of regret. And that gift is not for her benefit. It is the natural consequence of your strength. It is the echo of your value. But here's where this becomes even more profound. Regret doesn't just reveal the truth about you, it reveals the truth about her. It exposes her failure to discern. It shines light on her inability to honor what she had. And that exposure is painful, because regret says, you had it and you squandered it. You saw it and you dismissed it. You chose wrongly, and now you bear the weight of that choice. That's why regret cuts so deep. It's not merely about missing someone. It's about facing oneself and recognizing the gravity of your own blindness. And isn't that a lesson that applies to all of us? Think about your own life. Think about the regrets you carry. They're not just about lost opportunities or broken relationships. They're about how you failed yourself, how you dismissed what was good, how you were blind to the value that stood before you. Regret is the confrontation with your own failure of vision. And that's why it's so devastating. It strips away excuses and forces you to acknowledge the truth. Now, for the man who chooses to disappear with dignity, there's an irony here. You don't need to do anything to make her regret losing you. You don't need to shout, argue, or prove your worth after the fact. You simply need to walk away with composure, and regret does the rest. Because regret is not something you can impose on someone. It's something their own conscience imposes on them. And conscience, when awakened, is relentless. It keeps replaying the memory, it keeps digging, it keeps gnawing at the soul. And maybe that's the ultimate point here. When you vanish like a king, you force the world, not just her, but anyone watching, to confront the truth about what you were and what was lost when you stepped away. You don't have to declare it. You don't have to argue it. You simply embody it. And in that embodiment, regret blooms naturally. It grows in the soil of absence. It feeds on the memory of what was taken for granted, and it becomes a teacher far harsher than any lecture you could deliver. So don't fear regret, not your own, and not the regret you awaken in others. Regret is proof that value existed. Regret is proof that you mattered. And when you disappear with dignity, you ensure that your absence delivers a message louder than your presence ever could. I was here. I had weight. And you'll feel it now whether you acknowledge it or not. That's the power of regret. It's not just memory, it's revelation. And when it comes, it cannot be ignored. So remember this. You don't have to make anyone regret losing you. You only have to carry yourself in such a way that, once you're gone, regret becomes inevitable. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of communication. Most people think of it as nothingness, as an absence of words or expression, as if it carries no meaning. But silence, properly wielded, can be heavier than any speech, sharper than any criticism, more unforgettable than any outburst. When a man chooses silence, not because he's weak or suppressed, but because he's strong enough to withhold, it becomes a language of its own. And that language is profound. When you've disappeared like a king, when you've walked away with dignity, silence becomes your companion. It's not the silence of avoidance, nor the silence of emptiness. It's the silence of presence withheld. And in that silence, there is immense power. Because silence forces others to sit with themselves. Words give them something to argue against, to dismiss, to twist. But silence leaves them alone with their own conscience. And conscience, as we've said, is relentless. It keeps whispering truths that can't be silenced by noise. Think of the moments in your life when silence has struck you hardest. Perhaps after an argument when the other person said nothing at all. Perhaps at a funeral where words seemed futile and silence filled the air like a weight pressing on the soul. Silence reveals what words often hide. It reveals depth. It reveals gravity. And it forces reflection in a way that noise cannot. So, when a man withdraws and refuses to fill the void with desperate words or endless explanations, he's not being passive. He's making a decision to let silence speak for him. And silence often says more than any crafted argument ever could. Because in silence, the imagination of the other person takes over. She replays conversations, she reinterprets gestures, she fills in the blanks with her own conscience. And the absence of words gives weight to every unspoken truth. There's a philosophical depth to this. Silence is not emptiness, it is potential. It's the canvas upon which memory and meaning are painted. In music, silence between notes is what gives the melody its rhythm. In speech, the pauses carry as much weight as the words themselves. And in relationships, silence is the space where recognition and regret grow. When you stop speaking, when you stop chasing, when you stop justifying, you create that space. And in that space, the truth begins to echo. What makes silence powerful is that it cannot be controlled by the other person. She can ignore your words, dismiss your presence, mock your efforts, but she cannot silence your silence. It lingers, it hangs in the air, it follows her when she's alone. And the more she tries to distract herself from it, the louder it becomes. That's why silence is often described as deafening. It presses on the conscience in a way that noise never can. But again, this only works when the silence is born of strength, not of weakness. Silence from a man who's afraid to speak is different from silence from a man who chooses not to speak. One communicates cowardice, the other authority. And people feel the difference immediately. They know when silence is avoidance and when it is power. True kings choose silence, not because they cannot speak, but because they know their silence says more than words ever could. And here's something crucial. Silence doesn't just affect others. It affects you. It trains you to master your impulses, to resist the childish urge to always explain yourself, to fill every space with words, to chase validation through noise. It cultivates restraint, patience, and presence. When you learn to sit in silence without feeling the need to collapse into speech, you're training yourself to inhabit strength. That strength becomes part of who you are. It shapes the way you carry yourself, the way you respond to conflict, the way you command respect. In relationships, silence also shifts the dynamic. Because when you don't respond with noise, you don't give away your power. You don't give her something to push against. You allow her to sit with her choices. And in that silence, she feels the consequences of her actions in full. She is forced to recognize the value she dismissed. She's left to confront the echo of what she lost. And that echo, again, breeds regret. So, silence is not the absence of power, it is power refined. It's the decision to let your strength be felt rather than explained. And in many ways, it's the final stage of disappearing like a king. You don't need to announce your worth. You don't need to argue your case. You don't need to justify your departure. You let silence carry the weight of your presence, even in your absence. And that silence transforms everything. It turns what could have been dismissed as ordinary into something extraordinary. It elevates memories, magnifies gestures, and intensifies the recognition of your value. Silence teaches the lesson your words could never teach, that your presence was not a given, that it carried meaning, and that its absence has consequence. So, understand this: silence is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. Silence, when chosen, is strength in its purest form. And if you can master it, if you can wield it without bitterness, without fear, then you don't just disappear, you ascend. You leave behind not noise that can be ignored, but an echo that grows louder with time. And that echo will haunt her. So the challenge I leave you with is simple. Don't just walk away. Learn to let silence speak for you. Because silence, when carried with strength, doesn't fade. It lingers, it teaches, and it transforms. And when it's over, when the dust settles, it is not your words she will remember. It is your silence.